Welcome to the interview where we go beyond the headlines to ask the esoteric questions the national media doesn't seem to be asking. We're talking Russia-Ukraine today. President Trump and Vladimir Putin are set to meet in Alaska. Now, this is a high-stakes effort to maybe end the war in Ukraine. European leaders are warning that any agreement must uphold Ukraine's borders. Our guest today, Dr. Ronald Suny, who is a distinguished University of Michigan historian and University of Chicago professor emeritus. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Suny.
I'm happy to be here.
we very much appreciate it. So let's talk about President Zelenskyy. He says that there will be no deal without Kyiv at the table. Is he being left out?
He's being left out of these initial discussions, which isn't the worst thing. That is, it seems to me that two great powers, the United States and Russia, are going to discuss, maybe we'll call it the parameters of the discussions to come. And if, in fact, there's no ground on which Trump and Putin agree, then we won't go much further. And maybe then Trump will be moved back to one of his two positions. One position is Zelenskyy is holding things up. He has no cards to play. He has to give in. No NATO for him. All of these kinds of things. And the other position is, oh, it's Putin, no, that's holding things up and that's bombing the cities of Ukraine. And he's not being sincere about a ceasefire. So right now, I think Trump is feeling out Putin. Maybe they've already made a kind of preliminary agreement about what things would be acceptable, and therefore Putin has decided to go to Alaska.
Let's talk about the borders. What territory do you expect President Zelenskyy will have to give up, if any? What do you think of what Russia is holding now that they may give back, won't give back?
Russia is holding much of eastern Ukraine, maybe something like 15 to 20% of the country. These were areas that at least the Russians and Putin believe were Russian populated or Russian speaking. Actually, they weren't. They were mostly Ukrainian by nationality, but largely Ukrainians who did speak Russian and many Russians. Those areas have been officially annexed. That is, they're officially by Russian law a part of Russia. No one else recognizes that, but Russia, maybe Belarus, but no one else does. And those areas are things that Putin is not going to give up. Now, he holds some land outside of those areas, near the city of Kharkiv and on the way to Odessa. Maybe he's interested in Odessa. So there are some little areas that he would go beyond. Those would probably be given up by Russia, but most of that eastern Ukraine is Russia's not giving it up. They're not giving up Crimea, which is part of Russia in their view. And Zelenskyy will be forced, especially if Trump agrees with this idea, to give those up to Putin and Russia.
Let's pivot to oil. Russia, of course, runs on oil. And revenues have plummeted dramatically, down to $9.8 billion, which is already straining Russia's economy. But they are bolstered by this wartime growth, which happens whenever a country is engaged in this kind of very long conflict, going back to Crimea in 2014. First of all, one of the greatest rebuttals I often get when I'm discussing this is, because Russia continues on and it seems as though sanctions and the reduction in oil revenues has almost no effect on them. How much can we trust the numbers coming out of Russia, number one? And number two, how long can this go on from a fiscal standpoint for Russia?
What we know, and it's not particularly contradictory, but it's interesting to put these things together, is that the Russian economy is suffering to some degree. There is inflation, and there's clearly some restrictions on trade with other countries. People can't travel the way they might, etc. So there are those kinds of problems. But given that China and India in particular are buying cheap oil from Russia, and even some countries in the West are buying such oil, means that Russia survives and even prospers to some degree in that market. Now, why doesn't the West or push harder to sanction anyone who trades with Russia and buys Russian oil? Partly because if you stop the flow of Russian oil internationally, guess what happens? There's less oil in the market. That means oil prices go up. And do you think that President Trump and the Republican Party in power want prices at the gas station, at the gas pump to go up? No, obviously not. They're bragging that they're keeping those down. So here's this odd, bizarre thing. You want Russia to suffer. You want the Russian oil not to be bought. And yet you don't put the restrictions necessary on those who are buying it because, in fact, you don't want world oil prices to go up. Figure.
Yeah, no, I think it's very easy to figure. There are some external organizations like the IMF, for example, that are evaluating the real GDP of Russia. And it is a bifurcated economy, it appears. There's sort of the military-industrial complex on one side, and on the other side is internally, what's happening inside of the country and production there. And it does appear that on that latter side, everything is collapsing all around Russia. Is there any way through a macroeconomic modeling perspective to decontaminate or disentangle the oil question in the military-industrial complex from the rest of what's happening within Russia?
Well, we'll have to let these macro economists who are basically working in the area of guesswork to do it. What I know, and I talked to a lot of Russians, and I've met some this summer face-to-face even, and I've talked to others on the phone, they think life is going on normally. Now, remember, statistics and reality might be one thing. Maybe the economy is suffering, and it probably is. I think inevitably it is under current conditions. On the other hand, what's important to people is perceptions, how they think they're doing. And in fact, Russians overwhelmingly that I've talked to think things are normal. Oh, you tighten your belt here, a price has gone up there. But in fact, there's been very little disturbance in the daily life of most Russians.
Yeah, that's very fair. How much of this do you think is also affecting what may happen with Taiwan? Because Taiwan is likely looking at this, in China, of course, realizing that if, for example, the United States, the West, backs off substantially and Russia is able to get the upper hand here, aren't we looking at an invasion by China almost imminently into Taiwan?
Yeah. Just the opposite, I think, just the opposite. If I were Xi Jinping, I'm thinking, what are my priorities? My priorities are to have a prosperous economy, to somehow figure out how to deal with these pesky Americans who are trying to push me back into an earlier stage of development, who are restricting my economy, who are placing high tariffs on me. I've got to get over that. I've got to, in fact, think of a way to develop this economy. Now, what did he learn from the invasion of Russia? By Russia of Ukraine? He learned how hard it is to fight an enemy that is determined to resist on land, on relatively flat land. Do you know how difficult it is to have an overseas invasion? Think of D-Day and all the preparation and all the difficulties of that incredible event. So this is not a time that Beijing is interested so much in an invasion of Taiwan. If Taiwan moves, under American encouragement, perhaps, toward independence, which I don't think Washington will do, then there would be a different equation. And indeed, even public statements, the Chinese have made the point that they wouldn't even be prepared to invade Taiwan for many decades at least to come.
Yeah, you mentioned D-Day, and if we could look back at both world wars and the eventual solution of East Berlin and West Berlin, and if there might be some parallels you can draw between that and how Ukraine eventually would be divided up, perhaps. I mean, I know that, of course, Zelenskyy wants to maintain the integrity of Ukraine, whatever that means, in his mind. But do you see some historical reflection points there, and how so?
So first of all, I think the whole situation in Ukraine is tragic. Ukraine didn't want this war. It wasn't Ukraine that started the war. It was the Russians who started the war. They invaded because of a perceived danger they felt from NATO, from the United States, from the West, from the Ukrainians becoming a base for the West, all of those kinds of things. So a tragedy has occurred. Now Ukraine has fought heroically. Everyone admires how they defended themselves. And yet they lost a huge amount of territory. territory. If the fighting goes on, they will continue to lose. At one point, President Trump said in that confrontation, that ambush of Zelenskyy in the White House, that you have no cards to play. Well, in fact, they don't have many cards to play, especially if the Americans take the deck away from them. That is, it's the Americans who will decide. It's Trump who will decide in his own capricious way, changing his mind almost on a daily basis, whether or not they'll send weapons to Ukraine or whether they won't send weapons to Ukraine. Now, that's a very dangerous situation. So basically, we've got to watch carefully what's going to happen on August 15th in Alaska. If, in fact, Trump agrees with Putin that there has to be a settlement in which Russia keeps the territories that it has, most of them, maybe with some adjustments, and Trump has mentioned those adjustments. And secondly, there'll be no NATO admissions for Ukraine, and there'll be some adjustments internationally in relations between Russia and the rest of Europe and the United States. If that happens, then Ukraine is pushed into a corner and will have to, I hate to say this, capitulate to these two great powers who are deciding without them, without the Ukrainians in Alaska, the fate of the world. It reminds me sadly of events in 1938 in Czechoslovakia when the great powers decided how to deal with that situation. And you know what we call that? We call that appeasement.
Yeah. Why? What was going on there? I don't think we've spoken since what you described as an ambush by President Trump. That was how you described it of President Zelenskyy. Clearly, there was a conflict playing out in front of the world. How much of that was theater, and what was the point? What was the point of that?
I think at that point, Trump, who is going back and forth, first favoring Putin, as he has done historically, they seem to have a special relationship, and then getting upset and then being against Ukraine. And many Republicans have been against Ukraine. They don't like the spending of all this money, etc. And then moving and that was the moment of the confrontation in the Oval Office. And he was very rough, he and Vance, on Zelenskyy. And then as Zelenskyy tried to apologize, capitulated, tried to agree and make a deal with Putin, with Trump. Putin went on with the war and seemed not to be willing to make any agreements. And Trump changed his mind and was very critical for a long time against Putin. Now we're at a very particular juncture. That is, he's ready to work with Putin, and Putin seems to have made some overtures to Stephen Witkoff that they can, in fact, make a deal. And so this interesting summit is about to take place. Now, we can't predict. We'd love to be prophets. We'd love to be fortune tellers. What is actually going to happen? But this is a situation in which day by day things change so rapidly and so unpredictably, given the mind of Trump, that we have to wait and see what actually comes out of this.
Yeah, it's very hard to separate the minerals deal that was signed into, and obviously what the United States probably would eventually take from this. And we know that Ukraine has 22 of, I think, 34 minerals that the EU considers to be critical. And it seems as though that Alaska might create some sort of architecture where it's like minerals in exchange for a deal. That we want access to your land, we want access to these minerals, and if you don't capitulate, then you don't get any of the territory back. And that ultimately that's really what this is about. It is about getting access to Ukraine's very rich resources. What do you say there?
The current administration treats foreign policy as any businessman would a deal. And that is, profitability is also something that they think about. And the minerals deal is a good example of that. Or take what's happened recently when Trump, in fact, brought the Armenian prime minister and the Azerbaijani president, they've been in conflict for 30 years or so, together, and made a deal to stop the conflict between those two little countries. And how are they doing it? The United States is going to take a corridor and that's going to run through Armenia to link up two separated parts of Azerbaijan. And we're going to pay for this. American taxpayers are going to pay for this, but at least that conflict will be at an end. And you wonder, what is in it for the United States? Well, in fact, Trump, who's the most powerful man in the world, who's won the presidency twice, has one big thing he really wants. and it's a Nobel Peace Prize. What if, in fact, he carries this out? He actually establishes peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and my goodness, that's small potatoes. What if he actually brings about a ceasefire and some kind of even eventual peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, which changes the whole architect of European and American security? He might be a likely candidate. Now, there's a problem for Trump, because there's another big conflict in the world that he has not dealt well with, and that's Gaza. There's a genocide going on in Gaza. The Israelis are starving people to death. They're bombing and killing dozens of people every day. And there, the Trump administration, like the Biden administration, is basically supporting Israel to the cost and to the horrors that the Palestinian people are suffering. Will Oslo, where the Nobel Peace Prize is given out, will they actually overlook this? Will they overlook a genocide in order to give Trump a Nobel Peace Prize for his other efforts?
Yeah, I do want to get back into that, because I know you feel pretty strongly about that. But there's a wrench that's been thrown into that peace deal that was brokered by the United States, and that an advisor to the Ayatollah said on Saturday that Iran would, in fact, block this transport route, and that this is something that they will do no matter what. And that was very central to the peace deal. Can Iran do that? And does that mean that de facto that deal is bogus?
No, because in fact, Iran has been defeated recently, bombed by Israel and by the United States. It's in a very weak position. None of its proxies, none of its allies are in fact Hezbollah or the Houthis or the Hamas. None of them are in a position to resist. Iran might make trouble, but in fact, with the United States willing to do this, and Russia out of the picture, by the way, in Armenia and Azerbaijan, because of their war in Ukraine, they've retreated from the Caucasus. What you see in the South Caucasus in Armenia and Azerbaijan is that the United States is now a player in that region, which is between Russia and Iran. And this is a very significant geopolitical shift. Way back when, at the end of World War I, the League of Nations, or at least the people who were about to form the League of Nations, offered the United States, that is President Woodrow Wilson, a mandate over Armenia. That is, they would come, Americans would come and in fact defend and protect Armenia. Well, the Republican Senate under Henry Cabot Lodge said no, the mandate failed. Armenia then fell into the hands of the Soviet Union and became the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republics for 70 years. Now it's an independent small state. It has no good friends in the neighborhood, no one it can depend on. Iran was one close one. That's about it. Doesn't give it much cover, nevertheless. And now the United States is moving in. So in some ways, though Armenians are very suspicious of this, this is an amazing advantage. The United States into the Caucasus and keep Russia out of an area that it's dominated for several hundred years.
Yeah, how close are we to seeing direct U.S. involvement, do we think, in the Ukrainian conflict? Is that something that's on the table, do you think, ever?
I don't think so. I think no regime, certainly not Trump, who doesn't like sending soldiers anywhere. He wants to withdraw them wherever he can, as in the ones that are protecting the Kurds in Syria. No, that's not likely. And the Biden administration, too, never wanted soldiers, American soldiers, involved in active fighting. Oh, there were some advisors here and there, and of course weapons and all the rest of it, and maybe some instructors on pilots, etc. But no, we're trying to keep out of a great power war directly between the United States and Russia, between NATO and Russia.
Is there something that we're giving Vladimir Putin by meeting with him, and I mean de facto, obviously through President Trump, that this one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin gives him an advantage, at least on the world stage, via appearances that the United States is willing to work more closely with Vladimir Putin than it is to work with President Zelenskyy?
Hilary, you are putting your finger on the wound here. This is the thing. Now, I've been talking as a historian, as a political scientist, I've been talking about things that are happening and that have happened. Now, as a journalist and a pundit thinking about the future, then you begin to speculate a little. And here's my speculation. We'll find out if I'm wrong. I think that Putin and Trump have a kind of understanding. And that understanding means concessions to some of the things that Putin desperately desires. And what are those things? Territory in eastern Ukraine that Ukraine may not officially acknowledge, but will be gone. Secondly, American recognition of the annexation of Crimea, another Ukrainian territory, by Russia. That's something that Putin really wants, the official recognition. Thirdly, no NATO for Ukraine. The United States can stop any effort, since they were one of the initial powers that invited Ukraine to join NATO, though they never followed through on that. That will be another thing. And there's a fourth thing. Putin vaguely talks about reconfiguring the international system, the security system in the area in Eastern Europe around Ukraine. How much of concessions that will be, how that will bring in Europe, we have yet to see. But my sense is that and we'll see, I may be dead wrong here. It may be that Trump is feeling out Putin in Alaska. But my sense is that he's ready to make concessions, significant concessions to Putin in order to get a ceasefire, force Ukraine to capitulate essentially to Russian demands, and walk to Norway to get that peace prize.
Could we see the other framework of this, perhaps that there is a true paradox that's emerged in that we have continued to support Ukraine with military aid, and the talk about expansion of NATO, which we've kind of been back and forth about, that obviously Zelenskyy wants to enter NATO, and sanctions, a lot of sanctions, historic sanctions, and yet we still will not pull the trigger on the kind of sanctions that could cripple Russia. It is within our ability. It certainly is with the EU and the United States working together. That paradox is glaring, and it exposes a question about what the end game is here for the United States. Maybe this is just all about some long-term political play that we can't foresee, because we're sort of talking and acting out of both sides of our mouths. Are we not?
What the United States, ultimately would love to have is a pro-Western Ukraine. That is what will be left of Ukraine after Russia annexes those parts of eastern Ukraine that it's already occupying. That would be already something the United States would like. And we have a mineral deal there. We would have a buffer against a Russian invasion or any incursion toward NATO, et cetera. And that would be something we want. What Putin wants is a neutral Ukraine, one that's not in NATO, but also is not militarily very strong. In other words, he wants and is demanding some restraint and some limits on armaments to Ukraine. Now, how much of that the Trump administration is willing to concede when we wish we could have very much dominant influence in the remaining part of independent Ukraine, we'll have to see. That's part of the bargaining that's going on. And you, again, put your finger on it. We've been very lax in imposing these really punishing sanctions on Russia. And partly that's because ultimately there are deals to be made. There's oil that has to be exported. There's some sympathy by Trump for whatever reason, and it remains somewhat of a mystery to me, toward Putin personally and even toward Russia. Maybe a place to eventually build a Trump hotel, something of the sort.
Do you expect Russia to start nation building? Is this something that they are going to get in the business of if they see themselves as having a win with Ukraine? Will they try to annex other territories, go after other sovereign nations in Europe?
People make this speculation that, oh my goodness, if they take Ukraine, and then they'll go into Poland, they'll go into NATO countries, they'll go into the Baltic areas, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which are all members of NATO. I think that's ridiculous. I think Russia has paid a huge price, hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million people dead or wounded in the Russian Republic. For all the damage it's placed on Ukraine, and it's been horrific, Russia has suffered enormously in terms of casualties, in terms of losses. So this war in Ukraine, which is bogged down down means that it doesn't have much more ability to take the rest of Ukraine or to threaten NATO seriously. And so I think all of that is kind of fantasies and not understanding what Russia's true goals are, what it really would want, even more than territory. The territory it would like, they need some win to convince and show people back in Russia, yes, it was worth doing this. Look, we're now bigger, even bigger. I mean, I don't know why the largest country in the world that can hardly govern its own territory needs to get bigger at this point, but apparently that's part of it. But what they want much more than territory is a new kind of architecture internationally that will restore Russia as a great power, at least in its own neighborhood. It wants to be a hegemon, a dominant power in Eastern Europe, somehow in the former Soviet space. That's really what I think is Putin's ultimate goal. That would be how he would define security, even more than the territories he's taken over at such great cost in the last couple of years.
Yeah, the USSR is done for a reason, though, and it is not a hegemonic power. It never will be. It doesn't have the GDP to compete. It doesn't have the military might to compete, and it's just taken a tremendous hit as a result, as you've just described, in human capital and other resources. So what would you think, and I know I am also asking you again to be omniscient here, to sort of look into a crystal ball, but what do you think would be a win for Putin?
I think he would, first of all, let's face this. One, he lost the war that he wanted to win. He launched this war in 2022 to take Kiev, decapitate Ukraine, probably kill or drive out Zelenskyy, and make Ukraine a satellite state of Russia, sort of like Belarus, right? That would be enough for him. He lost that war. And then he fought and has fought this drudgery of a war of attrition against Ukraine that's led to stagnation, but also the taking of about 15 to 20% of Ukrainian territory. Now, maybe he could sell that to his people. Oh, look, we now have these new provinces, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and so forth. Okay, now we have that, and that should be enough for us. But what he really wants, the real victory, the one that is a little bit abstract and hard to, is a new calculation about the international order that would restore Russia to some status as a great power. I'd put it this way, not a global great power like the United States, but a regional great power, sort of like China.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how that shakes out. How close are we to peace? If there's a timeline that you could speculate about.
On August 16th or 17th, I could tell you that better. We have to see how this thing actually works out. I think it's going to be difficult. I have a feeling it's 50-50. One, it'll either be that, in fact, Trump gives in to Putin's major demands, or Putin maybe gives in a little bit and compromises a bit. That would be the good solution. Or the whole thing falls apart and the war continues. That would be sad. That would be additionally tragic to both Russia and Ukraine, as well as the rest of the world. But trying to predict at this point, we don't even know going into it what cards everybody's holding, what their real desires and discussions have been. Let's see after that meeting what falls out and what we can find out.
Okay, my final question here in our last about 30, 45 seconds here. Is Crimea going to remain in Russian hands?
Forever. That they will use nuclear weapons if they have to keep it. So that will never leave Russia. No, it's historically Russian. It's been Russian since the 18th century. It was largely Russian speaking, largely Russian in ethnicity. It wanted to be part of Russia for many years after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was a referendum. It was not a quite honest referendum, but Putin would have won any vote that was taking place there after he seized the peninsula. So it seems to me that's a foregone conclusion.
All right. Dr. Ronald Suny, thank you so much for your insight. It's always some of the best, literally, in the world. We appreciate you taking the time on this Sunday afternoon, and we wish
And
you
I
well.
appreciate it, too. Really good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a very good evening. Bye.
Okay. And
all right, that's going to do it for us for the interview. We'll be back again next week at 4:30. Have a great afternoon.